Everyone. My name is Susan Glassman, and I am a co-president with Ruth Erisman of Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. We are delighted to have you all with us tonight. When we started doing virtual programming in April, we weren't sure how it would go. We've been thrilled with the response, but tonight we have the biggest response of ever, not surprisingly, given the topic and given the level of interest. So thank you to the speakers and thank you everyone who is participating tonight. Before we begin the program, I want to draw your attention to several Women's Voices programs that will be happening within the next month. And I'll mention them very briefly, and then I will ask people who are interested to visit our website at womensvoicesraised.org. But very briefly, on November 19th, the Racial Justice Book Club will discuss The Person You Need to Be, How Good People Fight Bias by Dolly Chu, if I'm pronouncing her name right. On November 20th, in partnership with Empower Missouri, Women's Voices is co-sponsoring a 2020 Racial Equity Summit. The keynote speaker is Dr. Starsky Wilson, who until recently was the CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, so many of you probably know him. And now he has accepted a position of CEO of the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, D.C. And on December 10th, our monthly education program will also be tragically timely. The topic is Stop the Bullets, Community Efforts to Reduce Gun Violence. As I said before, you can register for any of these programs on our website, womensvoicesraised.org. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to thank board member Lisi Bernstein for proposing and organizing this program. Thank you so much, Lisi. So we are delighted to have three outstanding presenters for tonight's program, and I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, and they can decide among them who will speak first. If they don't say anything different, I will call on them in alphabetical order. The first is Dr. Anita Manion, and she is an assistant professor of political science at UMSL. She's a political analyst for various regional media outlets, and her research is focused on the impact of public policy on economic equality and inequality. Dr. Gena Gunn McClendon is Director of Voter Access and Engagement and Financial Capability and Asset Building Initiatives at the Brown School at Washington University. And Jason Rosenbaum is a political correspondent for St. Louis Public Radio. He spent 4 years after J School in Jefferson City writing about Missouri politics, and having moved back to St. Louis to work for public radio, he continues to focus on Missouri politics. Each of our speakers will speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, and their remarks will cover an assessment of the mechanics of the election that we've just survived, the likely impact of both state and federal results on social justice issues, things that we care most about, including healthcare, reproductive rights, racial justice, criminal justice reform, and gun violence. And they will address the impact of the passage of Amendment 3 and their general impressions of an election that has been like no other. During the presentations, please use the Zoom chat function to write down any questions that you may have of our speakers. And at the end of the remarks of our speakers, Nancy Nix-Rice, who is our program chair, will facilitate the Q&A portion of the program. Thank you very much. And as I said earlier, I will introduce you in alphabetical order, unless you have decided something else among yourselves. So let's go first with Anita.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, and I'm delighted to be here with Gena and Jason. So a little overview of how the election actually functioned itself. This is one part. I'm going to give us an A+, America. I think we actually did a pretty good job if you think of the fact that we were dealing with a global pandemic that nobody knew what status we were going to be in on November 3rd, where things were going to stand, that we are running not one election, we are running thousands of tiny elections and tens of thousands of elections, and that we had historic voter turnout. So our election authorities were dealing with things on multiple fronts, and I think that they did a good job. And I think some evidence of that is that there are people certainly digging in a lot of states looking for problems. And thus far, I've seen no evidence of major voter fraud or disenfranchisement. So it seems to me that we did a pretty good job running these elections. My experience voting in St. Louis was good, and I know my students was too. I was excited not to just see historic voter turnout, which I'm always happy about, but also a big surge in youth voter turnout, which is near and dear to my heart. So on that front, I'm going to be optimistic. I won't be so optimistic in all of my remarks, unfortunately. Then you asked us to talk a little bit about how these election results are going to affect social justice issues. On the state level, I don't have very optimistic framework to present, because right now what we have is a landslide election for the Republicans in Missouri. So if you're supporters of that party, you're very enthusiastic. But I wouldn't, for folks who are hoping for social justice reforms, racial equity reforms, expansion of reproductive rights, I think you're going to see the opposite. We have the Republicans hold all the statewide offices. Governor Parson had a runaway victory from Nicole Galloway that was not what was predicted by many pollsters. We can talk about pollsters. I'm sure we'll get questions about that later. And the Republicans hold a supermajority in the state house. Governor Parson is also going to be able to appoint, some Missouri Supreme Court judges and all kinds of other positions. So I don't think you're going to see a wave of progressive reforms in Missouri over the next couple of years. And also, we're going to see that the state legislature is going to have control over redistricting, because we just had a census. So that could mean drawing Missouri's districts to be even more red. And on that, I will go ahead and talk a little bit about Amendment 3. That was Missouri statewide ballot initiative that was on the ballot in November, and that passed 51-49. So a pretty narrow margin. And what this did was it overturned the ballot amendment known as Clean Missouri that was passed in 2018 by 62% of Missourians. And that reform changed how we do redistricting in Missouri, or it would have had it been implemented, to a nonpartisan state demographer that would have done that. It also had some lobbying reforms in that package too. And the Missouri State Legislature did not like that change in their approach to redistricting. So they countered with this amendment, Amendment 3, and got it on the ballot. It did pass. So it's interesting in some ways that Missourians voted against what they voted for 2 years ago. I think there's several factors at play here, and Jason will probably have something to add to this. But it seems to me the first issue was the ballot language. So the ballot language focused on some pretty minor lobbying reforms of $5 on one side and $100 on the other side. But those were the first things that voters read. And so I know, some folks in my own life who saw that, voted one way, voted for it, and then later said, because they voted early. And I think actually a colleague of mine earlier today shared some data he put together, and early voters in Missouri voted more in support of Amendment 3 than folks who voted later in the districts he looked at. So he looked at, like, in theory, folks who voted for Biden in Amendment 3, you would expect that to line up a bit. And there was a bigger divergence in people who voted earlier. And so the inference that he was making is that maybe early voters weren't as informed on this issue. They read those first couple lines and said, gosh, yeah, let's limit lobbying gifts. And so I think that ballot language was a big part of it. The folks who were against Amendment 3 had a lot more money. You probably saw the commercials and the signs. But one thing that the people who supported Amendment 3 had was the Farm Bureau helping them lobby for this in rural districts. And again, my colleague put together some good data on this, and it showed that districts that Trump won overwhelmingly were the districts that supported Amendment 3, and the districts that he lost were the districts that went against it. So not necessarily surprising, but it's good to actually have the evidence and see that that was the case. So that means in Missouri, we will just largely continue the system we had before. Our bipartisan commissions never came to, like one out of the last 6 times, came to an agreement on a map. So judges ended up drawing those maps. And the other controversial part of Amendment 3 is that it does open the door with some language about one person, one vote, that only maybe eligible voters could be counted in redistricting. Now, there are arguments about if that's what would happen. Some of the supporters of Amendment 3 say, well, we didn't mean to leave out kids, which this could leave out kids. It opens the door for that in the counting for districts. We just wanted to leave out folks who are not here legally. So I think that that's definitely something to watch for, to see how people will be counted for redistricting, because Amendment 3 does give some opportunity to change the way that we do that. On the federal level, I'll try to keep it brief here and wrap up. But on the federal level, I think, people who want progressive reform probably are breathing a sigh of relief that when they say President-elect Joe Biden, he's probably going to have a cabinet that's more reflective of America and more progressive. I know Bernie Sanders floated the idea of being labor secretary out there, I think today. And so certainly executive actions that Joe Biden's going to take right away, his cabinet members, changes in the Department of Justice could help on issues of racial equity, policing, other things. But I think legislatively, we really have to wait and see what happens in Georgia in those 2 Senate races to know if anything's going to get done in Congress in the next 2 years as well. So there's lots more to say, but I'm going to stop there and leave the rest to Gena and Jason to talk about.
Okay. So I want to start off by saying thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this conversation and be on a panel with Anita and Jason. So my impression of the election is a little slightly different. So generally, I thought that the voting process was much better than in previous presidential elections. Specifically nationally, because of the extraordinary number of get out the vote campaigns. So there were lots of print media. There were things about educating people about being able to make a plan, plan to vote. There were lots of efforts on the ground, particularly here. So as much as possible, but it wasn't a smooth process for minority people, for Black folks. It took an army of civil rights lawyers, activists, and volunteers to just combat the egregious voter suppression tactics in order to make it possible for Black voters to be able to vote, at least make it less cumbersome. And even in that specific instance, it wasn't necessarily less cumbersome. So the ability to vote freely for everyone is just going to require more fundamental changes to the system. So, while we may not have exactly seen that here as much, but it does exist. There are always voter suppression issues that have to do with keeping primarily Black people from voting. All different kind of tactics. One is, for example, the idea that Kanye West, to put him on the ballot, right? So, he's some rapper personality. And I literally saw people here in St. Louis City trying to get him on the ballot. And that is a ploy to take away the Black vote. Here's a shiny little object here. I want you to look at this while we're doing something over there. So fortunately, he did not get on the ballot here, but he did in 4 other states. I think the result of the Get Out the Vote campaigns, again, there were lots of webinars, there were lots of activity around Rise to the Polls, phone banking, just getting people to recognize that there are opportunities for people to vote, things like notary hubs and things like that. When I think of the other thing I took a look at is voter registration in 2020 versus 2016 was down. There are actually fewer registered voters. And I just kind of wonder, well, what's going on there? Is it because of, I suspect, COVID and the inability of people to hold in-person voter registration drives? Maybe there's, I'm sure there's a population loss, could be an explanation of that. And then maybe it's just indifference. So there were actually like nearly 7,000 fewer registered voters in St. Louis County in this time compared to 2016. And same thing in St. Louis City. Statewide, there was a difference of about 128,000 people. But then there is the idea of something else that good that happened is the Missouri expanded the voting rights statute, so making it a little easier for people to, by adding an extra excuse for absentee voting. So people were, if you were exposed to COVID or had any risk factors, you were able to vote absentee. And then of course, mail-in was open to anybody, but then there are downsides to the mail-in because it had to be, you had to actually receive the mail-in ballot via mail and you had to return it via mail. Now there were some lawsuits that tried to make changes on that, but to no avail. But in with regard to absentee and mail-in voting, about 800 and about a little over 800,000 absentee ballots were requested, and about a little over 800,000 were returned to each local election authority, according to the Missouri Secretary of State's website. So you kind of wonder, what is the difference? How can you explain that? And I think some of it has to do with mail-in ballots as well as absentee ballots were probably turned in and surrendered, and people went in and voted in person, absentee in person, and as well, or on election day. I think that may account for some of it because of all of the noise around mail-in ballot and the postal service and that kind of thing. And so a lot of people in the circle in which I do this work were pushing and getting people to go in person to request absentee as opposed to mail-in ballots. What other thing that was real positive to me was access to voting. So for example, St. Louis County this time had, well, they've had satellite locations, but I think they had 1 or 2 additional. But what was interesting is that on election day, I was doing election protection work and going out to different poll places, trying to get people in St. Louis County, it's rather than standing in line, letting them know that they had an opportunity where they could go someplace else and actually vote within their county because they could vote anywhere. You'd be surprised at the number of people that I talked to, and they did not want to get out of line for one reason or other. And so anecdotally, what I found out is that some of them considered it a badge of honor to stand in line. It was a privilege to be able to do that and wait. And I think others just didn't believe me that they could go anywhere. And then I think others felt like if they went someplace else, the line may be longer there. But anyway, it was a good thing. In St. Louis City, it was fabulous. They had satellite locations for the first time that were in libraries geographically, spaced in north and south and the central part of the city. There were lots and lots of volunteers that actually signed up with election protection. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a national program. Oh, I tell you what you will be familiar with is 866-Our Vote. So that's the National Election Protection people. Denise Lieberman reported that there were over 1,200 people statewide that volunteered. That is, I think she said that's like double, maybe even triple of what we've seen over the years. For quite a few, maybe about 1,200 hotline calls on election day, another 2,500 during the whole voting period. So the point is that people were engaged, people knew about the number, and they wanted information. The other big thing was the misinformation incidents. So this time election protection actually had a group of people that were watching social media because, the things that were being said there. So the other thing I would say too is because of the number of people that voted, I think that it's a reflection of maybe people thinking about, being able to apply voting to their personal lives. But I also like to think of it as a way of a new beginning for democracy. And I say that because, for a lot of reasons, but I'm just going to point out one thing so I can keep it moving. So we have our first African American and Indian American woman who is a member of the first Black Greek letters sorority, which I am a member of, proud member of. And she also graduated from a historically Black college and university, and so did I. So that's a big deal, big triumph. You know, and I still can't remember, I can't believe that somebody that looks like me is in the White House, and it, you know, will be in the White House. So, you know, while President Obama's election was momentous, but this Vice President-elect Kamala, it's sort of like the icing on the cake for me as a Black woman in America. And so there aren't any words to express how I and countless others feel about this. But what the Black community understands is that this isn't over. So even though I was excited about this win, there's still kind of left this void, you know, so there's still a lot more to be done. When thinking about voter turnout, and I'm sure most of you all know that in St. Louis County it was about 69.55%. In the city, it was 60%. So my reflection about this are, who are these voters? You know, out of this 160 million people, are they new? Are they previous registered voters who hadn't voted before, or, you know, in the last couple of elections? And why did more people vote? So those are a couple of things that I was thinking about. Was it because of the current administration? Was it they were upset about COVID? Was it social justice issues? And, you know, probably all the above. 73% of young Black people voted for the first time. Amazing. 90% of Black women voted. There was an increase in white women voters that voted for the other party that didn't win. And it's my understanding that a lot of those voters came from the South and many from the suburbs. And so I have to wonder, you know, kind of what is that about? Is it because, you know, they're married and they're doing what their husbands told them to do, or is it because of the noise they heard about the message of defunding the police, the protests that they saw? Is it a reflection of economics and power and racism? You know, and when you think about it, there two things or more can be real at the same time. So, and then of course, is it a referendum against the current president? So, Anita covered Amendment 3 really great. The only thing I would add to that is that Missouri, we get to be the first ones to have an amendment like this. We get the privilege of having this. And what's interesting to me is how the same people that voted for Clean Missouri voted for this bill, you know, for this legislation. And so you got to wonder, you know, really what's going on. So regarding the refusal of concession, you know, I mean, watching and seeing that the president hasn't said anything in 6 days, this particular president, radio silence, you know, in my mind, that is a concession because he's not saying anything. And what's nearly as bad is playing his voters as gullible and having little respect for them. You know, for example, asking for money for his campaign and anything over $8,000, they basically get to keep, you know, frivolous lawsuits, the racism and racist antics with these parades of people riding around in pickup trucks waving Confederate flags, and, you know, and all of that is, while it's intimidation and it's, you know, the idea of a civil war, but it's also, in my mind, the bigger picture with this is it's a money scheme, you know, because people are taking their hard-earned money and they're giving it to these organizations, you know, and you know, anyway, that's just my personal opinion. I'll leave it there. But in thinking about what's next and what states can do, what we're going to see is an increase in voter suppression laws. We can count on it. You know, there'll be a lot of stuff on mail-in voting. There'll be stricter voter ID laws. There'll be closer to poll locations. There'll be increased efforts at the state level for parties to, you know, regarding getting attorney generals, secretary of states, governors and legislators, so we can count on all of that. But I'll stop there. I do have some comments about what the country should do next, but I'll leave it there.
All right. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Again, I'm Jason Rosenbaum, a political correspondent with St. Louis Public Radio. And I was counting on my fingers about what election cycle this was for me, because I count 2004 when I was a student reporter at the Columbia Missourian, and I'm 36 years old, and this is my 9th election cycle in Missouri, which gives me a lot more institutional memory than most people, which is kind of sad, because when I started out here, there were people like Virginia Young and Terry Gainey and Bob Priddy, who had been reporting on Missouri politics for 30, 40 years. Joe Manis, my colleague of many years, who is now semi-retired as well. And I don't think I've really ever seen an election cycle like this one for a lot of reasons. Number one is the obvious explosion in early voting in Missouri. I would concur that I think that the election was administered as well as it could, but I don't think it was as intuitive for voters as it could have been in other states. The fact that we had this bifurcated system where you could have an excuse, and in some excuses you had to get it notarized, and others you didn't have to. And then you had this mail-in ballot option that you could get for any reason, but it had to be notarized and put in the mail. It was very confusing. It required me to write like a 10 to 20, not 20, but 10 to 15 question explainer on this. And somebody commented, when you're making an explainer on voting, it's probably not very easy to follow for people. And I think that the problem is that there's been a lot of opposition in the Missouri legislature to go to no excuse absentee voting. It's something that, frankly, a lot of election officials of both parties want to happen, because what is happening now, and what I'm almost certain happened in this election, is people are putting down excuses that are not actually true. Like they may have put down the fact that they had COVID-19 or immunocompromised when they weren't. They were just afraid of getting COVID. But there's no enforcement mechanism to prove that a voter had COVID-19 or is immunocompromised or have any of the specific symptoms that were listed there. And I think in the minds of a lot of election officials, they would rather stop this charade that's been happening for years, if not decades in Missouri. Just go no excuse absentee, let anybody get it for any reason, have a certain amount of time when you can get an absentee ballot, mail it back or drop it off or vote in person. And leave it at that. That's not what happened. I know a lot of election officials wanted just a specific excuse saying you're afraid of getting COVID-19, therefore you can vote absentee without a notary and do it in the traditional way that we do absentee, and that didn't happen. I'm not super optimistic that we are going to have a more, I've been using the word intuitive, but just easy to follow absentee system. I don't expect that the system that we have right now is going to be extended. So it does provide the legislature an opportunity to rethink this. This wasn't really a situation where, the absentee drastically changed the results. We had, like in many states, especially in St. Louis County, primarily Democratic voters use absentee or mail-in voting to vote early. But those advantages in St. Louis County were wiped away by the in-person vote in a lot of key races. The two that come to mind are Ann Wagner versus Jill Shoup. After the absentees came in, it looked like Ann Wagner was a goner. And then when the votes were cast, Ann Wagner won St. Louis County, which showed that the absentee didn't really matter that much. It may have created almost an illusion that she was in trouble, because in Missouri, the absentee ballots are actually counted very quickly and are actually available at 8 p.m. based off the way that they're processed. But maybe that's a sign to Missouri Republicans that absentee balloting is not some Democratic scheme that's going to get them out of power, and it's just a way for voters to have a more convenient option of voting. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens on that. I wouldn't be super optimistic about it. As far as like the overall election results, it's almost like Missouri is operating in a parallel universe to the national environment. And this has basically been happening for the last 4 election cycles, if you include this one, where voters have overwhelmingly voted for Republicans and Republican candidates on a state legislative, on a congressional, and on a statewide level. And this was the first time we actually saw them vote on a ballot initiative, because there's been this message that I've been hearing a lot about, well, you know, Missouri's not really that conservative because we voted to increase the minimum wage, or we legalized medical marijuana, or we passed Clean Missouri. And I always kind of push back at that narrative because I think it was taking a lot of nuance out of it. A lot of those initiatives that I just mentioned had anemic, if not non-existent, no campaigns. There was a no campaign to Clean Missouri, but it fell apart once it was clear that it was going to pass, because the messaging behind Clean Missouri, even though the proponents were talking about the redistricting plan very much in detail, what you saw on TV was about cleaning up Jefferson City and passing lobbyist reforms and making campaign, and the people were saying it in shorthand, it was a campaign donation limit initiative, when the campaign donation aspects of Clean Missouri were totally irrelevant, didn't deal with any of the problems that came about after Amendment 2 in 2016. And it was really about redistricting. I guess in seeing the fact that Donald Trump won the state by about 15 or 16 points, I'm not surprised Mike Parson won by a lot, or any of the other statewide officials won by a lot. There is no scenario where a Democrat could win statewide when their presidential candidate is losing by 15 or 16 points. So it doesn't matter that some people have said, like Nicole Galloway didn't run a good campaign. Well, I didn't think she ran a bad campaign. She just ran into the Donald Trump train, just like Chris Koster did and Jason Kander did. There's nothing you can do about that. What was more surprising, though, was Amendment 3 passing, because there was another anemic yes campaign for this. This wasn't a situation where the Republicans that wanted this passed had all this money and organization to pass it. It was the opposite. The no campaign got millions upon millions of dollars to try to defeat this. They ran all sorts of ads pointing out how, and I'll say it, the ballot summary was misleading, and not for reasons that people have been saying. Yes, it was misleading because it emphasized the lobbyist gift and donation limit things first, and didn't really explain how they were even more meaningless than the Clean Missouri campaign donation limit things. But what really bothered me was that the description of the redistricting changes made it seem like this bipartisan commission would actually do something, because it said it had the responsibility over redistricting, when as Anita mentioned, and I've been pounding this point home with very little success, the judges are almost more likely than not going to draw the maps under Amendment 3. There's certainly a possible scenario where you find 4 Democrats that are secretly going to approve a map with, I guess, 10 Republicans, because you need 4 Democrats to cross over. I'm sure that Democrats who are going to be putting these people forward are probably going to ask them, like, hey, are you going to approve a map by Republicans? And if they say, yeah, then they're probably not going to be put forward. There's probably going to be some due diligence among the Democratic Party before they put people on these commissions. So I think that the main crux of Amendment 3 is you've just transferred a lot of power from this nonpartisan demographer that had to draw districts with an emphasis on competitiveness and partisan fairness, and to appellate judges. It was frustrating to me as a reporter that wasn't the debate. It was all about, well, are these shady insiders going to draw maps? Without it, when the scenario that they would actually come up with anything that would actually be meaningful was remote. I never said it's never going to happen, because it did happen under very unusual circumstances in 2012. But the parties in Missouri do not have an incentive to vote for a respective map. they have very different opinions of what counts as advantageous redistricting. Republicans like compact districts that particularly put Democrats essentially in very heavily Democratic districts in the city and the county. They also like the idea of having a lot of minority majority districts that are heavily African American, because a lot of white Democrats for many years have liked the idea of spreading some of the Black voters into whiter areas. That was the entire conflict and just to be clear, Amendment 3 was all about state legislative redistricting, but I'm using this as an example to showcase the conflict between white and Black Democrats in St. Louis. William Clay, who's Lacy Clay's father, got into a lot of really visible conflicts with Richard Gephardt about putting part of his district in the second district. And his district was majority African American. And he always rebuffed that because in his view, if you spread too much of that population from the first district into the second, you opened up the possibility of the first district being represented by a white person. And after many, many, many years of not having that congressional district being represented by an African American, that was not something that he wanted to do. Now, some people clearly disagreed with that and said that that was self-defeating because it allowed Republicans to win more congressional races, but that's just the reality. And I think what you're going to see under Amendment 3 is basically similar maps to what you see now. You're going to see, districts that are heavily condensed in the urban areas that are very Democratic. You're going to see some swingy suburban districts outside of the city because St. Louis County is becoming more competitive, even central and western St. Louis County, even though it didn't go this time for Democrats. I do see that being the trend in the future of places like Central and West County being more competitive than they were before. But everywhere else, it's going to be super Republican districts because Democrats have proven that they cannot win conservative suburbs like St. Charles and Jefferson County. They have completely fallen off a cliff in rural Missouri to the point where places that they were winning 10 years ago, like Northeast Missouri and Southeast Missouri, are voting for Republicans 75-25. And I don't care how you draw the maps. You can't be a majority party if you are losing in that fashion. Missouri Democrats have been winning for many, many years by building what I consider an urban, suburban, rural coalition. And that has been a coalition that's had a lot of ideological conflict because when they had rural members of that coalition, they were clearly more conservative than people who were in the urban or inner ring suburbs in St. Louis and Kansas City. But that allowed them to wield real power by holding governorships or holding majorities in the state legislature. And now they don't have that anymore. They have very little leverage to really do much of anything. And so the question is, how does that affect things like abortion rights or gun control or police reform or listening to people who are protesting over police killing Black people? It doesn't provide Democrats with a lot of leverage to actually accomplish those things. The one thing that I think is a possibility is that there has been a strain of Republican thought about being more amenable to quote unquote criminal justice reform. And that didn't have to do with police, but it had to do more with sentencing and probation and parole. It would not surprise me in the next year or two if you saw Republicans working with Democrats, especially African-American Democrats, to maybe come up with a plan that provides more systematic applications to hold police officers who have clearly done things wrong accountable for their wrongdoing. Because I don't think that there's a lot of appetite, even among a lot of like police groups or Republicans, to hold up bad cops, even though clearly like their messaging is very like, we support the police, we support the police, we support the police. Now that the election is over, I think that I have a little bit more optimism on that front, but not much optimism that all the restrictions on abortion are going to be undone. I don't think we will ever see in our lifetimes some more restrictions on gun control that are on guns that are that are in place elsewhere. And I think we're going to continue to see an aversion to taxing things and providing more resources for things like public education or transportation or healthcare. The one thing that's the exception, and then I'll stop because I'm sure people want to ask questions. Missouri did vote to expand Medicaid in August, and it's not optional. It can't be overturned by the legislature. It can only be overturned by another vote of the people. And a lot of hospitals which is a very sizable interest group in Jefferson City that influences Republicans as much as Democrats, want to see that followed through on. So it'll be interesting to see how Republicans follow through on that, whether they try to put any landmines in the way of that. But that is going to be a really impactful thing for a lot of working poor Missourians, because Missouri had one of the lowest, I believe, eligibility rates in the country. And now it's going up to, I think, 133 or 138% of the federal poverty level. That's going to make a huge difference for people, especially in this era of COVID-19 and economic uncertainty, that they may have access to healthcare than they didn't have this year. So I do think that is light at the end of the tunnel, and it does kind of go into the idea that Missouri does gravitate toward progressive issues, but only in situations where the no campaign doesn't put up much of a fight. And even that rule of thumb got turned on its head this cycle. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so I'm going to stop talking now.
All righty. Thank you so much, all three of you. My head is exploding, and I thought I knew a lot about this stuff. So I really appreciate the insights you've shared. Want to remind all our participants that you are welcome to put your questions, please, into the chat function on YouTube where you're able to watch this, and we will pass them along to our panelists. And while you're doing that, I've made note of a couple, and I, in my notes, didn't address them to any specific one of the three of you. So please feel free to just dive in. Lisi asked, actually, your opinion about whether the chances of someone with more progressive views prevailing against Ann Wagner in a year when it isn't a presidential election?
I'll field that one first. I think the answer to that is no, and there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, Ann Wagner, whether you like her or not, and I'm sure many people who are watching this are not fans of her or are not fans of her politics, has proven 2 election cycles in a row that she can win in a district that has become rapidly more Democratic in the last 10 years. And when she was targeted by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, she won by a larger margin this year than she did against Court Van Ostrand in 2018. That's number one. Number two, the 2nd district is going to be redistricted because the congressional redistricting is done by the legislature. State legislative redistricting is done, as we just talked about, most likely by judges. And Republicans are openly talking about putting all of St. Charles County in their district. Now, there's a lot of St. Louis County Republicans that don't actually like that idea because they would see the writing on the wall that when Ann Wagner goes away, they will have 0% chance of winning that district and it will go to somebody from St. Charles. But the upshot of that is, even though Democrats have wanted St. Charles County to be more competitive for them, it is not. It is a Republican stronghold. And if they succeed in doing that, which I think that they very well could, that district will be, frankly, unwinnable for Democrats. So that's my view. Anita, do you have anything to add to that?
No, Jason, I agree with all of that. And I too have seen the talk about St. Charles in District 2. I will say, I think part of Lisa's question was, underlying factor there was, did turnout for Donald Trump in 2016 help Ann Wagner in a way she wasn't helped in 2018? And might 2020 look more like 2018? And I am curious about that, the Trump factor, to see what may happen in the midterm election. So I do think that's a factor there. But I do agree with Jason as well that Ann Wagner is a strong candidate. And I suspect that she took Jill Shoup a little more seriously than she took Court Van Osteren. She came out swinging, certainly, with the attack ads and other things. So, so you can keep a glimmer of hope for 2020 and hope that that the Trump folks won't turn out. But you know, Ann Wagner won St. Louis County in a bigger way in 2020 than she did in 2018.
Can we go home now? Sorry. Back to serious questions. Rick Stream was quoted as saying that, I believe he was referring to Milwaukee, that there were more votes cast than there even were registered voters in some district. Is that a fabrication? Do they have the opportunity in Milwaukee to vote in any precinct that was convenient the way we did here? Is that how that would come about? What's up with that?
I can talk a little about this, or I don't know if Gena wants to. You know, one of the most frustrating things to me right now about this election is the undermining and the falsehoods that are out there right now. So when I talked about giving our election process A+, I did not mean our voting laws. So Gena is certainly right. There are issues with voter suppression, and Jason is certainly right. There's lots of confusing things, particularly in Missouri. But I was talking about our election officials and how they ran this election. And they ran it with integrity and efficiency. And they were being questioned and undermined at every point. And thus far, I see no evidence to undermine the way that they've ran their elections. So that claim about what happened in Wisconsin, it is fake information that's out there. Wisconsin election authorities put out information to dispute that. So it's just literally fake news, if we want to use that term, but it's not accurate.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I have a clarification for our participants as well. I'm getting information now that says that our listeners can text questions to this phone number, and I'll give you a second, all of you out there, to grab a pen or pencil. Because apparently the YouTube chat is not functioning correctly. So questions can be texted to 314-730-0471. Okay. Then just a comment that is showing up in the chat here on YouTube, that it's interesting that Amendment 3 was proposed because the legislators said that the citizens didn't know what they were voting for in Clean Missouri. So they designed Amendment 3 so that citizens wouldn't know what they were voting for. Is anyone acknowledging the irony of that, or is it just business as usual? Thoughts?
Well, the first, I'll tell you, the first thought that comes to my mind is the assumption that everybody's stupid, you know, so they didn't know what they were voting for. Of course they knew what they were voting for, right? And so, you know, I'm curious about why people voted, the same people voted for it. And I think a lot of it has to do with messaging. I think that while the Amendment 3, say no to Amendment 3 campaign went well, I think there were a lot of things that they could have done better, like start earlier in explaining what was going on. And I think the connection between people voting absentee, doing in-person early, but I mean, because voting, you know, you could go vote absentee September 22nd. Well, you didn't really start seeing this real hard push for that amendment until, like someone said, after people had already, I think Anita mentioned this, that people had already voted. So I think it had more to do with that than people not knowing. They just didn't know what it was. And they didn't get a good explanation about it. And so they just went with the first thing that they heard. So
there was another strategic failure that I've heard about amongst the Clean Missouri people. Some and this is not detractors from the Republican side. This is actually, I've heard this from the Democratic side. They felt that Clean Missouri should have been on the ballot this year, not 2018, because by putting it on the ballot in 2018, it gave the Republicans a chance to repeal it right before the redistricting cycle. Now, that is that may seem cold, and people may be like, well, it's not the responsibility of the Clean Missouri people to decide like what the legislature is going to do to react to it. But if they would have put that on the ballot in 2020, well, we would be doing the Clean Missouri redistricting system next year, because there had been no way to repeal it, because you have to do redistricting in 2021. That's number one. I actually didn't think the NOS campaign was that bad or that ineffective. I think that they were trying to showcase to people how misleading the ballot summary was in their commercials. It clearly didn't happen soon enough if there was really like this analysis that people that were voting early were voting for it. But I will just say, having talked to a lot of Amendment 3 supporters, they really weren't emphasizing the lobbyist gift or donation limit things. In fact, the Farm Bureau chief said that was an attempt at trolling, because, and this is his words, not mine, because they felt like what the Clean Missouri people did in 2018 was exactly what they were doing, and they were just playing them at their own game. Now, you can think that that's misleading and unfair and hypocritical too, but that's basically what they told me. They were talking very much about the redistricting part. I think the issue is that redistricting is such an insular and difficult thing to really encapsulate to ordinary people that don't pay attention to the intricacies of it, that even if you make the strongest argument possible that this Amendment 3 system is going to be bad for X, Y, and Z, it just doesn't, it's not absorbed by voters, because redistricting is not something that they completely understand or completely care about. But I think that the reason it passed was the ballot summary. I think we can get really deep into psychological voter psychology, but the ballot summary was absolutely murderous to Clean Missouri.
Well, and I'd like to add too that I think people don't understand politics, or they confuse politics with policy. And I think that most people aren't educated about issues, or know how to find it and expect other people to kind of tell them what's going on. Because even though the ballot language, we know the ballot language was misleading, an average voter may not know to investigate that and how to investigate it. So I think that has something to do with it too. But in my mind, I really, really think that the campaign didn't start those ads and things soon enough.
Thank you. New question. Lots of concern because the process of absentee voting and did or didn't you need to have it notarized, and could it be mailed, and all that confusion. What do we know about how many attempted votes were spoiled because of not conforming accurately to the process? And it's also my understanding that early in the pre-voting, there were actually volunteers at the Board of Elections reaching out to people to come back in and correct their ballots. And now I'm hearing at the federal level that process is being challenged, and the current administration is asking for those votes to be discarded. Can somebody shed some light on all of that? Not all at once, please.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. So myself and the League of Women Voters and other volunteers were intimately involved with the St. Louis County Board of Elections. we happened to find out that there were a lot of ballots that were rejected. And upon looking at the reason why, it had everything to do with the design of the envelope and how the message that was there. So if you didn't affix your signature, if you didn't check a little box to testify that that was your address, or if you needed a notary and didn't get it notarized, then your ballot was rejected. And so I think giving credit to our Board of Elections in St. Louis County, they, I don't think technically they have to reach out to people, but they chose to do that to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to vote. And I'll tell you something, what was really a good thing about this, and then said at the same time, is that I was in the space when those calls are being made, and that's telling people what happens and that, giving them a way to assign. 2 people had actually died. So now we're talking about people who died thinking that they had voted, although if you died before the actual election, your vote didn't count anyway. But still, just the idea that someone went to all of that trouble to try to vote and they forgot to check a little box. So what they did is, I don't know if you noticed, but the envelope changed and tried to make it a little simpler so that people would understand what they have to do. Now, St. Louis City, on the other hand, this time what they did is they actually sent letters out to people. My next door neighbor got one. She's 80 years old. She forgot to sign it. And so she was able, I took her down and did curbside and she was able to sign it. So what I'm saying all that to say that I don't see why that's an issue if you're doing it in advance of the election and you're following those basic rules. And so it wasn't that I just, when I took her down there, she had to have her ID. I had to go and get somebody to come out and verify that it was her with her ID. So, you can make a fuss about a lot of things, and you can create a lot of noise about a lot of things that don't work. But at the end of the day, this is a democracy and everybody should have a right to vote, whatever that looks like. And so it's going to be real important moving forward. As I said, we're going to see a lot of different things challenged moving forward, especially mail-in, especially this in-person or absentee voting. There are going to be a lot of efforts to suppress and keep that from happening. So just stay tuned.
I agree, Gena. And for some of you who've heard this term cured ballots or curing, that's what they're talking about, is correcting those mail-in ballots, having an opportunity to fix that. To me, it seems entirely logical that we have these elaborate mail-in processes for reasons of voter security. Then if somebody misses one of those processes, they have a right to correct that. Those laws, just like all other election laws, vary from state to state. And the Trump administration is challenging this in Pennsylvania and other places, the cured ballots. Gena's right, these disproportionately affect, older people, young people. So like in Colorado, it's a high percentage of ballots that were rejected were young people because they have very few signatures on file. And if you think of the way you signed your name and they compare those signatures, well, if you voted 18 times, then maybe you have a number of signatures on file. But for younger voters, that was an issue. But lots of states have rules, and they vary, of how they can do this. As long as they're adhering to those rules, so far, judges have not sort of taken the Trump administration up on this. Generally, federal judges do not like to overrule state election laws. If you're adhering to your laws, then that's what you need to do. We will have to see how this plays out. I agree with Gena on saying, watch for how things evolve, and with Jason for saying, I don't expect the state legislature to try to expand ways to vote in Missouri. But I think if we're going to have an expansion of voting rights in Missouri, it's going to come the way we've done other things like Medicaid expansion and minimum wage. A group of folks who care about this, different groups would come together and get it on the ballot, and Missourians would have to pass this ourselves. That's how I think if there's going to be voting reform in Missouri, we may see it.
Jason, anything you want to add to that discussion? Or are you good?
I think that sums it up. I don't have anything to add to that.
All righty. Well, one last pair of questions that maybe intersect on the theme of where do we go from here? And one of them is asking your thoughts about what issues you think contribute to this overwhelming swing of voters in rural or outstate Missouri toward much more conservative candidates. And related to that, gosh, Georgia has managed to mobilize a move in a more progressive direction. What, if anything, could be learned from their strategy to advance more progressive causes? And is there a knight on a white horse to ride within Missouri to lead that sort of a transformation, again, parallel to what we've seen in another very red state?
So is there a Missouri version of Stacey Abrams?
Well, I would never mention a name or a party, but yeah, who's our Stacey?
I know that Jason has some thoughts about the rural issue, but since I already blurted out Stacey Abrams, you know, a lot of the approach she took in Georgia was not, this didn't just happen in the last 2 years. This has been a multi-cycle effort to engage voters, to get in every district in Georgia, to get to know those folks, to have good candidates, to do voter registration drives. So I'll pause on whether change can happen in rural Missouri and let the other two weigh in on that. But if it's going to happen, it will not happen by 2022. But you've got to lay the groundwork. You've got to be in those districts. You got to be talking to those folks. You've got to find candidates who resonate with them and the issues that connect with them. And I'll pause there and let the other two weigh in on this one because it's an important issue.
So I have heard some Democrats talk about Georgia as a blueprint. And I don't mean to be all doom and gloom here, but Georgia and Missouri are not the same states. Wikipedia is not a great source, but Georgia's demographics are radically different than Missouri. First of all, Georgia has a larger Black population. They also have a growing Latino population. Missouri has a large Black population, but not as large as Georgia, and we have a very small Latino population, and it's an overwhelmingly white state. So that is one barrier. The other barrier is the rural areas, which, as I kind of said earlier, have fallen off a cliff for Missouri Democrats. And the reason why, I'm actually pulling up an article that I wrote in 2017 when I went to Northeast Missouri, which is a place that I talk about all the time. It kind of comes off as like a pseudo obsession. I talk about Champ Clark, the former Speaker of the House, who's from Bowling Green, on Twitter almost incessantly. Should have been president of the United States, but unfortunately we got Woodrow Wilson instead, and that turned out very poorly for everybody. But the reason why a place like Northeast Missouri, which again had a majority Democratic state legislative delegation in 2006 and 2008, there's a few reasons. Number one, there's been a Republican congressman in Northeast Missouri for over 20 years now. The members of Congress have an enormous impact on local elections because they can channel their enormous amounts of money and organization to help state legislative and local candidates. And there's no Democrat doing that in Hannibal or Pike County, or let's move out of Northeast Missouri and Southeast Missouri, even mid-Missouri as well. So that doesn't help. Number two, the Republicans have been more well-funded, and they typically get candidates who are well-known in their community. So they get insurance salesmen and farmers and, county commissioners and local people that are willing to go and run for state legislative seats. And even the Democrats that are left in Northeast Missouri, or not Northeast Missouri, rural Missouri and county positions do not want to run for state legislative seats because they know they're going to lose, and they don't want to give up county positions that frankly pay a lot more depending on where you are. And number three, and this is going to come up as morbid, but the rural Missouri voters that were voting for Democrats are dying out. They are literally dying. They were people that were When I started in reporting, they were 60, 70, 80 years old in the early 2000s, and they are no longer with us. And then the people that are younger have switched over to the Republican Party because they perceive the Democratic Party as too liberal, even when Democrats run conservative candidates in rural races. Like, they cannot uncouple the image of the Democratic Party nationally with the reality of Missouri. And that all those combinations have been absolutely deadly for Missouri Democrats. I don't see any solution that they can get out of, barring just like complete dissatisfaction with Republican governance here, which I think is certainly possible. But I just think that there's no real easy solution for that. They have been talking about gaining background in rural Missouri ever since they lost the ground. And I have not heard of a really good plan for them to turn that around. And I honestly think that a lot of Missouri Democrats are thinking our best bet to return to statewide prominence is to build their base in St. Louis County, Kansas City, and Columbia, and also try to attract more voters in some of the collar suburbs that are, I think it's been a challenge for them because those voters are much more conservative than people where I live in Richmond Heights. So, but the thing is, and this will be my last point before I stop talking, you know, all this stuff does go in cycles. And Missouri was a Democratic state for most of its history before it became a red state. And on a presidential level, it was very competitive for many, many years. It's no longer competitive on a presidential level, which is another reason why Democrats have not done well here. Because if Democrats don't see this state as a necessary building block for the presidency, then they're not going to send them a lot of money and time here. So that hurts too. But, you know, things do change. And I think it'll be interesting to see how these next 4 years with President-elect Biden turns out with a divided Congress, and whether their dissatisfaction over that helps Democrats or helps Republicans. And I do think that there are cycles in politics and nothing lasts forever. And it's very possible that my definitiveness on some of the demographics of Missouri become a lot less definitive over time.
Okay, so my two cents on this is, you know, a lot of the national attention is with other states, and so, you know, if we don't have equal footing on representation from the Democratic side as well as the Republican side, I think that it causes a problem. You know, I think it makes a difference when people that run statewide races don't think it's necessary to come to St. Louis City, even put yard signs up. I'm telling you, I went to 30 different poll places. I didn't see signs for Nicole. I didn't see signs for Jill Shoup. I didn't see signs for Yinka Falate. I didn't see signs for anybody on the Republican side, for that matter. So I think that when people aren't paid attention to, or the ones that are paid attention to are the ones that are willing to make a change. That's one point. The other thing is that that this state, we have to figure out a way to understand the electorate and how to create a space that crosses all social justice issues, right? Because it's not always a matter of Democrats and Republicans. It's a matter of conditions and issues that people believe in. You know, I think we have a lot more in common than we don't have in common. I also think that understanding systemic racism, you know, it's a direct link, you know, from slavery and the foundation of inequities of all social and political justice issues, you know, from racial wealth gap, economic inequities, policing, felony disenfranchisement, criminal justice, climate change, healthcare. Racism is the beginning and the core of everything. And so, for example, you know, let's just start with the Constitution. You know, white men were the only people that were able to vote and be in leadership and have the power. So until some of those ideals hit Missouri and people start to figure out that, we need to come together, I think we're going to continue to have problems. I think it's important also to remember that the civil rights movement benefits all marginalized groups. And I was talking to a friend colleague today who said to me that the country needs a moment of clarity to reckon with the idea that a nation built on First Peoples genocide and slavery is going to perish. So I think it's just real important that until we understand our electorate and why people vote the way that they do, is it because somebody else is telling them what to do? Because they don't want to think for themselves or don't know how to think for themselves, or it's easier that way? I'm not sure what it is. Or is it because people don't understand that that what our discussion, what we're talking about, has a impact on their day-to-day life? And it doesn't matter whether you're rural or whether you're in urban communities, but people want to be asked for their vote. They want to know that people care about them. And if we can't figure out a way to do that, we're going to keep getting what we get. So
I
anyway.
agree. And Nancy, can I just add one more thing? So I talked about Georgia a little. I just want to say a few words about rural Missouri to piggyback on what they said. I agree with Jason's idea that our elections are so nationalized that it doesn't matter how conservative the candidate is in your district. She's Nancy Pelosi. She's, whoever you think she is, whoever she's connected to, AOC. And I think that, I grew up in Jefferson County, and that's one of those Keller counties that used to be Democratic and is strongly Republican now. I think the erosion of that union base, that sort of white working class group that voted on economic issues democratically, kind of like Gena's referring to, focusing on those common economic issues, that has been eroded. Some have aged out, and some have become disenfranchised when they lost those jobs. You talk about the politics of resentment, of finding other cultural issues, and the Republican Party has been very good at capturing the rural voters when it comes to cultural issues. I think that Jason's heard me tell this story, but in 2018, after the election, I was visiting the state legislature with some colleagues, offering our research for free, helping them on issues if they'd like. And we presented data to an elected official from Jefferson County saying, gosh, the voters in your district voted to increase minimum wage. They voted for Clean Missouri, and they voted to legalize medicinal marijuana. And you ran against all of those things, yet they voted for you. Help us understand that. And the legislator's answer was, my voters only care about two things, babies and guns. And as long as I say the right thing on those, the other issues don't matter. And so I think that is something that Democrats have to process and figure out how to break through that messaging if they're going to win over voters in rural Missouri.
Wow. So it seems that messaging is at the heart of the whole discussion. And that is going to have to be, or more detail about that is going to have to be a topic for another evening, because our time is up. But thank you again, all three of you, Jason and Anita and Gena. Thank you, Lisi, for organizing. Thank you, Laura, for tap dancing behind the scenes on all the technology. And we at least will live to fight another day. And it'll be, what's that proverb? May you live in interesting times. Goodness knows we are all able to say yes to that one. So we will be in touch with all of you who are viewing. Women's Voices will continue to be in touch with you. So watch our Facebook page and our website, and watch for our newsletter if you are already receiving that. And if you're not, by all means, visit our website and sign up so we can keep you informed. And have a wonderful rest of your evening.